Hi, everybody. My name is Donnell Baird. I am the CEO of a climate tech company called Block Power. We decarbonize and electrify buildings. The quickest way to think about it is just like Tesla can take the fossil fuel engine out of an automobile and make it all electric, smart, modern, all electric, clean energy. You can now take fossil fuels entirely out of buildings. And so that's important because 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in America come from our buildings. And if we're going to have any shot at dealing with climate change whatsoever, we're going to have to electrify all of the buildings across America. But what an amazing opportunity to create jobs, to increase public health, to remove mold, lead, asbestos, impact the lives of our kids and families across America. And I know the mayor has made huge commitments around decarbonization and electric buildings in his city, which we'll hear more about. But I'm excited to be here with all of you today. We've got an incredible panel. Let me introduce everyone quickly. So Mayor Hancock is going to make some opening remarks. He's the mayor of Denver. Glad to have you with us. We have Melissa Zanocco, who is the head of the infrastructure client group at Project 13, and she's going to be joining us virtually. Veronica Scotti, the chair of public sector solutions at Swiss Re. For those of you who don't know, Swiss Re is a giant insurance, or is it reinsurance company, Veronica? But a huge global player in that space. We've got Mark Enzer, the Chief Technical Officer at Mott McDonald. And we've got Kevin Bush to my left, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For those of you who don't know, the Deputy Secretaries are the folks who write all the checks to everybody. So we're very glad he's here with us. I don't know how I got invited to be the moderator of this panel, but we're gonna, I'm a startup guy and I'm gonna ask very direct questions that are a little aggressive. What we wanna figure out is, how do we create lasting value from the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's being created? When I was 27, 28 years old, President Obama and Vice President Biden passed a gigantic rescue package, the Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And there's various schools of thought of the lasting impact of that package. What we all know is right now, America has 4 overlapping simultaneous crises. We have the public health crises, we have a jobs crisis, we have a citizenship crisis, right? When you look at the political divide, the racial divide, the wealth inequality of our country, we have a citizenship crisis. And of course, we have the ongoing climate crisis that's gonna consume us all if we don't figure it out. And so how does this current bipartisan infrastructure bill create an opportunity for all of us as Americans to confront these 4 huge crises that we're all facing? So that's what I'd like to talk about today. No pressure. Moving beyond just the count of jobs and the revenue to the infrastructure projects and keeping expenses low, how do we create lasting social, environmental, transformational value? And I'm struck by what Carla shared at the end of the last session, where she said, if you're a legacy Detroiter, you've been here, you drive around, you see all this development, you're alienated from it. It has nothing to do with you. So how do we create infrastructure that's shared? We'll turn to the mayor for opening remarks.
Thanks, Donnell. And I got to tell you, I'm glad to be here. A real honor to represent the people of Denver, but also to represent mayors all over this country. And I'm honored that Mayor Steve Reed from Montgomery is here as well. I got to tell you, Donnell, the last panel was very impressive. They said some things that were extremely powerful. And just like you at the end, I think Carla Walker Miller said the most powerful thing, if she's still in this room, and that was, how do we create a legacy and to make sure that the people who were most impacted are most impacted by the development of our communities, by our massive investments, are not left behind. So let me just break this down real quickly. The mayors around this country had worked for decades. You got to remember that for almost 100 years, we had not made this sort of investment in our infrastructure that is now primed under this Infrastructure Act that was just passed by Congress and signed by the president. The mayors had been focused every year trying to figure out how to fix our crumbling roads, our unsafe bridges, how to address the challenges of affordable housing, how do we address our water systems, our waste systems, the unsexy stuff that's underground that you don't look at every day, but yet impact the quality of life and the safety and health of our residents every day without any federal partnership. And so when this bill was proposed by the Biden administration, and by the way, let's remind everyone that during Obama's term, he proposed the America Works program, which is similar to this infrastructure investment package. But we don't forget that the Congress said nothing this president proposes will get through Congress. And so Biden very wisely proposes this infrastructure bill, recognizing it's the quickest way for us to begin to recover from the pandemic and the economic turmoil from the pandemic, and also begin to invest in a manner that we have not seen in decades in our crumbling infrastructure. The challenge for us is not will we recover, it's going to be how we recover, to the question that Donnell is asking us. We have to look at it, as I think Tofi pointed out during the conversation in the last panel, like a system. Infrastructure today includes not just roads and bridges, it includes waterways and transit systems, it includes housing. And as pointed out in the last panel, it also includes energy and climate. And as we approach this systemic challenge, we must remember that the last time we made this type of investment was the interstate highway system. And the sins from that program, while created a great interstate system, absolutely debilitated, demoralized, and dehumanized communities of color and low-income communities. It divided communities. It broke them up. It tore them up. It disregarded them. And so as we advance this $1.2 trillion worth of investment, we must never allow that to happen again. In fact, we have an opportunity to make sure that we honor, lift up our communities of color and our low-income communities. We get a chance to put transit near affordable housing. We get a chance to address climate action that impacts low-income communities on a proportionally higher level than any other communities. We get a chance to talk about electrification and make sure it goes where people will need it. We get a chance to talk about, yes, Wi-Fi. Because the most embarrassing thing that happened in America during the pandemic was we found out that low-income communities still don't have access to Wi-Fi. We lost children, folks. Their education was disrupted when they were sent home. We get a chance to think about a system and correct the sins of the past. And let me give you one last one. $1.2 trillion investment in this economy is a lot of resources. Tonight I'll fly from here to DC to join a hub of transit directors and authorities, water districts, transportation districts, other mayors, airport district leaders, where we're going to sign a pact that we're going to increase contracting with disadvantaged businesses during this infrastructure spending that we're undertaking. If we turn the lights out on this once in a generational investment, and we have not created wealth in minority communities and women businesses, as in America, we will once again repeat the sins of the past. We won't have, as a generation, we won't have this opportunity again. And so this is our opportunity to accelerate, to think differently about bureaucracy, to be very intentional about bringing in women and minority businesses and say, this is your moment in clean energy, in transportation, in housing, in all of the things, electrification, all of the industries that will be impacted. during this great spin, we should be able to look back and say we've created new wealth, new opportunities, new businesses, and hopefully a new America. And so I'm glad to be here today, but we've got to make sure that we make sure equity is our guiding star here. We got to stop apologizing, and we got to be real about what this moment in time presents for us, and not to dismiss it, but to be very intentional about our efforts and say we're going to create a new opportunity that America has not seen and give a chance to right the wrongs of some of these great epic moments in our history in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The point is certainly well made that this is a unique moment to achieve transformational infrastructure. I'm going to turn to Mark. Mark, how do we think about structuring infrastructure projects in a way that produces real social and environmental outcomes? And what are specific use cases or case studies where you've seen this done well? And what can we learn from them?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, can I start by saying it's really great to hear from Mayor Hancock. You're speaking in such an inspirational kind of way. I mean, I think it's it's really important that we do have inspiration in this space. You know, that we have leadership that is visionary and can see past the immediate to a better place. So to kind of come back around to your question, how do we get that kind of value? I think part of it is by not obsessing about the projects, because it's really not the projects which are going to deliver the value ultimately. I think the starting point has to be the outcomes. It's all about outcomes. And that's what we should aim for. So if we're aiming for those outcomes, meaning better outcomes for people and for society and for nature, and let's include nature in that now, because we know that our well-being depends on the well-being of nature too. So the starting point has to be outcomes for people and society and for nature. And projects can't deliver that. Individual projects can't do that. What we need to do is see the system. And that's why I really liked what Mayor Hancock was saying. The challenges we face are systemic. It's about the whole system. And no one project can do that. We need to see our projects as interventions on the system. And we need to use the system, the whole amazing machine of our built environment, complex and interconnected. Like Mayor Hancock said, our energy, transport, water, telecoms, waste, all of these are interconnected. They all depend on each other and they all serve us. It's all kind of essential for our well-being and for our survival. So we need to see the system. In fact, not just a system, it's a system of systems. And I think we need to recognize that these great challenges of our generation are systemic challenges. Again, Mayor Hancock said that. But we can't solve systemic challenges in silos. We need to meet the systemic challenges with systems-based solutions. Now, in me saying this, it might sound like I'm a bit against projects. I'm not. I think projects are great. But really what we need to do is see that projects are interventions on the system. It's a system that can provide those outcomes for people. We need to start seeing our built environment as a service, our infrastructure as a service, and the outcomes come from that. So what this means is that we need to understand our systems better, and we need to intervene more effectively. And we need to do that. This is essential now, because these big generational challenges are systemic. The kind of thing I'm talking about is achieving net zero, it's climate resilience, it's achieving a circular economy. All of those are systemic challenges that demand systems-based solutions. So we've got to break the silos, we've got to understand the systems, and we've got to intervene more effectively. So that's the route, I think, to value.
Interesting. Let's turn to you now, Mr. Deputy Assistant Secretary. Actually, we'll come back to you, Veronica, in a sec. I'm curious as to how you would respond to Mark. Mark's suggestion is that we should start with the outcomes of a project, not the specific projects themselves. Meanwhile, we know that the federal government is very focused on shovel-ready projects. What are the levers that you might have that you can push and pull on to think about how projects and shovel-ready projects can be interventions into a set of existing systems that need change?
Great question. Let me just start by acknowledging where we're at. And I think, you mentioned this in your remarks too, and I know when the president came into office, he acknowledged the overlapping crises that we were experiencing as a country. COVID, the resulting economic crisis, climate change, and the racial and economic inequality that those three other crises have laid bare. This has required, and Mayor, I don't have to tell you this, has required a tremendous amount of local action. Before joining back the federal government as part of the Biden-Harris administration, I was working for the District of Columbia on their COVID response. And the amount of new services that we had to stand up, renting hotels, building hospitals, figuring out how to keep restaurants open in the middle of winter so that our businesses didn't collapse. These were a tremendous amount of new services that were happening at the same time that the demand for our existing services, housing, food, et cetera, was also increasing. And I think that the president's acknowledgement of those crises existing and the need to scale our response as a result is really important. And that's where we're finding ourselves now, right? We had the CARES Act, we had the American Rescue Plan, and we now have the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and hopefully we'll have the Build Back Better plan as well soon. So, 2 years ago in DC, I remember sitting down and talking with the mayor and the rest of the cabinet about an interesting virus that was starting to work its way across the country. That's almost 2 years ago on the button, and that's where we're at now. We by no means have responded completely to the crisis. We still have a lot way to go, and I think we're in the throes of recovery and pulling folks out that have been most disproportionately impacted by COVID and the economic crisis, not to say anything of the climate crises that have been continuing to burn throughout. So to get to your question, after we've established that context, where does the federal government come into play with this? Well, the federal government, like any national government, has a challenge is that we have to craft policy that works across scales. We have states, we have large cities, we have small cities. I have grants with the city of Detroit, and if you know Michigan well, I also have grants to the city of Midland and Bay City. Bay City, very famous for the birthplace of Madonna, in case you're curious. And when looking at those policies, there's really three levers that I think you can pull. You can inform action, you can incentivize action, and you can mandate action. And what we're trying to do is come up with the right approach that meets those communities where they're at in that scale and drives positive change and outcomes. So let's take climate as an example. Just a couple weeks ago, coinciding with the second week of the COP conference in Glasgow, the department issued its first, the Department of Housing and Development, where I work, issued its first ever climate and environmental justice strategy. And we paired those two together because the secretary made it very clear, kind of picking up on some of the comments from the last panel, that we can't just act on climate, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't create more injustices and also addresses those injustices that already exist. Because Mayor, as you pointed out, there's a tremendous amount of money flowing in to address these problems, and that's an opportunity to address other problems as well. So we put the climate and environmental justice strategy out. I encourage you to take it a look, really easy to find, hud.gov/climate. And we're also baking in climate resilience and a priority on low and moderate income individuals and neighborhoods. Those are, by the way, the folks most disproportionately impacted by climate, into our core grant programs. We already have some great work underway. The Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, which I oversee, is often used, and I know we'll get into public partnerships later on, as gap financing, and we're trying to make sure that it's being filled as gap financing for resilient, affordable housing. So we're not just building housing, we're building housing that's resilient and affordable as well. So we're taking steps now through our climate and environmental justice strategy with the tremendous resources we have, but we know we're not done either. The Build Back Better plan is still out there, and it lays out a strategy to create more good paying union jobs, cars, clean energy. I know we had Ford on here earlier. And there's so much opportunity out here. And, I think I want to make one last point because I'm up here with the mayor. We provide the funding, but really the local government's the ones that make it work. And it's pulling those resources together to address these crises. And the way the federal government can best help is by being that partner.
So you pushed it back onto the mayor. Fair enough. Thank you. So Veronica, I wanna, this idea that the federal government is a platform and a partner that's going to provide some resources to visionary mayors like the one that we have here. And the visionary mayor is going to help to figure out how to structure infrastructure projects that are interventions. Is going to require some level of creativity. It's going to require some level of public-private partnership with private sector leaders such as yourselves. Veronica, how are you thinking about the kinds of investments that you all have been making in green infrastructure, in resilient infrastructure in urban environments, and how might you apply that thinking to this context?
Thanks, Anel. And I am going to build on what Mark and others have said before. I actually think the opportunity is really extraordinary at the moment because we're going to see about $40 trillion of infrastructure by 2040, getting mobilized. And for every dollar we spend, we know that we can create a tremendous long-term investment if we are very intentional, to Mark's point, as to what kind of outcomes are we trying to create. So I think it's really a matter of how and what do we value. And there is an element of, yes, predictability of the cash flows, and through PPPs, you can try and remove some obstacles to the general market uncertainty. But if there is something that we've learned through the pandemic is that we haven't been thinking enough in system terms, because things that parts of the system would have called out, and for instance, we called out the pandemic back in 2007, they were just not part of the mainstream thinking. So I would say that this 40 trillion of investments that we're going to see coming to cities and to local communities have to be directed with that a more holistic system approach. And one of the dimensions that we have largely ignored to this point when we design important infrastructure projects is the fact that we have ecosystem benefits from nature that we've not fully incorporated into the equation yet. 55% of the GDP globally depends on that, and a fifth of our ecosystems are at a very high risk of stress or extinction. So when we take out these externalities, when we continue to treat them as externalities, what happens is once they're not there, we end up being in much worse conditions than we ever expected. So it's very critical that we put these externalities, whether they're positive or negative, into the picture, and we design with that system approach that Mark was referring to. Now, I've got some good news. Because you call me as a private sector speaker and as a representative of the financial sector, banks and insurance companies, I can tell you this system thinking and creating impact over and beyond pure cash flows is something that has resonated a lot with this community. And I think it's my conviction, you can quote me, right, even 10 years from now, I'm convinced we're going mainstream big time on this one. Because there is a realization that we need to pivot our activities to more comprehensive set of KPIs. And the momentum is off the chart. If you look at what was described in Glasgow, 130 trillion are required, 110 trillion are required for decarbonization of our global economies. We have 130 trillions already signed up formally with binding commitments. So it's not a cash flow problem. It's a mobilization problem towards the right projects. Or the principle of responsible investment. More companies have signed up in 1 year than in the prior 15 years. So I think we will see a big acceleration. And if I think of what is needed, on the one hand, I think a good example is what the European Union has done with the European Green Deal. They said, yes, we want recovery. They come out with a vision for Europe that puts a just transition, a nature positive transition, and all of their policies are being integrated so that there aren't evident gaps. They demand mobilization of the public sector. They incentivize it. I think that was Kevin's point before. They try and create the carrot and the stick. So on the one hand, they have the taxonomy. On the other hand, they say, here is 750 million that will go into sustainable and green infrastructure. And that helps the cities. And then they require the member states and their cities through technical support to actually execute it in a way that maps back to the principle of what we deem it to be good. And always with a, as I said, a nature-centric and a consideration to the climate scenarios of the future, not what we've been using in the past. From a Swiss Re perspective, we very much would like to be part of this different type of mobilization. So I can tell you today we have 2.6 billion already invested in what we call social and green bonds and sustainable bonds. And we want to take it to 4 billion in 2 years by 2024. We want to invest more in social infrastructure and renewable energy infrastructure, an additional 750 million in the next 2 years. And the problem, so our biggest issue at the moment is finding the right projects and making sure that this reaches the community with the impact that we expect. And for that, you need to have more transparency about those projects. So an ability to design the projects with specific KPIs, being able to monitor and report on a consistent basis, so that as a leading player in the financial industry, we want to be able to report on that. And we will have to report on that already by the end of this year, according to European and international taxonomies. We need to be able to demonstrate what is the value and the impact of those investments and make sure that we're looking at quality impact and quality value. Reputationally, if we don't do it right, we'll be accused of greenwashing, which no one wants, right? So it's super important that we are working together with the public sector and with the mayors and the communities to identify sustainable long-term impact in these projects. And there are some good examples of things that we've done. I'm happy to cover later, because I'm convinced that if Swiss Re as a company is doing it, there is 130 trillion of like-for-like capital that is waiting to go in this direction. So it's a very important moment to define what good looks like for all of us.
Thank you, Veronica. So we've got resources and direction and a once-in-a-generation investment from the federal government. We have capital markets that are at the table and ready and willing and able and looking aggressively for high impact, social impact and environmental impact projects. We know that projects can have systemic impact, as Mark outlined. And so Melissa, we'll turn to you, because I think Veronica outlined the need for the kind of really the last mile delivery system of the development and the implementation of projects that fit the criteria that we've started to outline on this panel. So how important is last mile distribution or delivery or development, depending on your lingo, in developing transformational infrastructure projects?
Yeah, thank you. So what I think I'm really going to follow on exactly from what Mark Enzer was saying and from what Veronica was saying, and really give a practical example of a model that is there to deliver new infrastructure. So if you've decided that you do need to deliver infrastructure, you've been through sort of Mark's process of looking at, could you just optimize what's already there? Could you just modify what's already there? But you've kind of come to the conclusion that you have to add to what's there. And then how can you do that in a way so that it's outcomes driven and so that it becomes an intervention on the wider system of systems rather than being a standalone siloed approach? So what I'm going to talk about is Project 13, which is an industry-led change movement. And it's actually aimed at trying to improve the way that infrastructure is delivered to create the greater value that we're talking about. And it's a model that can facilitate things like green finance and create more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So at very headline terms, Project 13 basically advocates moving from a transactional approach to a more integrated collaborative model. And it brings together the right capabilities and the right technologies into integrated enterprises. And the movement itself, it involves and benefits from a wide range of bodies and organisations from across the globe. But it's actually the infrastructure owners that are the key sponsors. And that's recognising that the changes that are promoted by Project 13 have to come from, and they're ultimately going to be owned by, the infrastructure owners. And in the UK, that's kind of represented by, particularly by the Infrastructure Client Group, which is made up of the most innovative economic infrastructure clients in the UK. And a few years back, they got together and looked at exemplar and poor projects from across the infrastructure landscape. And this was led by the University College of London, but included also practitioners. And they identified the aggregated characteristics that they saw in those projects that have defined the overall approach to Project 13. And that is so important for what we're talking about today, because it means it's not some future hypothesis or theory, but Project 13 is actually drawn from current industry best practice. And it's actually already being adopted by several clients, both in the UK and globally. So basically it advocates that shift from the traditional transactional approach, where you've got the linear relationship between the clients, the consultants and the contractors. And it's all around competition. So it's around work and scope. And that often drives the adversarial behaviours around gaming and the parent-child kind of dynamics, which basically creates the value-destroying behaviours and doesn't sort of give any regard to the supply chain. So all the things that we've been talking about today, the current model, you can't maximise on that. Whereas the enterprise brings together the right organisations in integrated and collaborative teams that are engaged to deliver outcomes and not work. And that recognises the need to create that environment for the enterprise and the integrated teams to operate so that we can enable the positive value-adding behaviours. So Project 13 is basically a set of principles, and that's on purpose. That's so that it can always be flexible, and it's got the ability to be applied to a range of circumstances because it doesn't sort of delve down into the detail. And I was just going to pick out 4 key shifts that I think are relevant, particularly for today. So the first one is that the enterprise itself is formed around delivering the outcomes. It's not delivering work, the scope, or the outputs. So the capable owner is articulating the outcomes, both for the customer, but also at the societal level. So at the level of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And ideally in a mature organisation, they should be able to trace back the outcomes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the national objectives, like in the UK, that would be levelling up or things like net zero, community outcomes, the things we've been hearing today, as well as the actual outcomes of the investment itself. So not the cost, but the value of the investment. Number 2, to pick out the ability to integrate the digital technology with the engineering so that you get intelligent and smart solutions. So that the end game is that we sort of assemble the assets and we put as much value onto the data or the digital twin as we do onto the physical asset itself. So that's kind of going back to what Mark was saying, is that we need to stop seeing infrastructure as a series of projects. And when we see it as a system of systems where all of our assets, new or old, are interconnected. And so when we design and build them, we're doing it as an intervention on the overall system. And the third one is the rewards model. And that's outcome focused as well. So it's not based on scope or hours or volume or even turnover, but instead it's recognizing value and rewarding outperformance. And then the fourth one is moving away from transferring risk to understanding risk and the capabilities that manage it, and then incentivizing through the commercial model to mitigate them. So I was just going to end just telling you practically what have we done. So since its launch in 2018, we've got a growing group of formal and informal adopters, both in the UK and globally. And the formal adopter community is currently made up of 15 programmes that are putting the principles into practice, and they're sharing their learning and challenges as they do so. And then in March of this year, we launched an interactive web-enabled community where members can connect with other practitioners and experts and innovators, all of whom are interested in delivering infrastructure in this different way and putting the Project 13 principles into practice. And that community is now fast approaching 2,000 registered members. So our plan is that through the formal adopters and this web-based community, openly sharing lessons and good practice, the common principles and ideas, we believe that we can accelerate the transformation of the industry so that it does become more sustainable and inclusive.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, I want to circle back to you. I want to go back to Carla's comment at the end of the last panel, your response to it, and your comment in your opening remarks about the digital divide and losing children. You know, once the pandemic really got going in New York and, you know, people having heart attacks on the street and we couldn't put them into the back of the ambulance and couldn't fit them into the emergency room, things were dark. That was bad, but it gradually started to emerge that 27% of our kids in New York didn't have any internet whatsoever. So they were stuck at home. Their parents couldn't work remotely or even apply for unemployment. There's no telemedicine. There was nothing. There was no internet. There's no fiber infrastructure. And so what we did is we worked with a philanthropist who just said, look, we got to figure this out. Here's $2 million. Can you put in rooftop temporary internet systems? These, you know, there's this hardware innovation. There's like a 3-foot antenna. You put it on a roof and it can shoot internet for 2 to 3 miles in every direction. And you can connect a series of antennas and basically you can spread internet throughout a community very cheaply without having to dig up the ground and do large infrastructure projects. But we had a last mile delivery problem because we were in a pandemic and we had to get workers to go into buildings and there was no vaccine, and we couldn't figure out how to incentivize all parties to participate in emergency infrastructure project. And so what we ended up doing at the end of the day is we created a holding company and we just put stock in the holding company and handed it out to the construction workers, to the building owners, and to the heads of households who needed to be connected to the internet in order to provide a financial incentive for everybody to participate in a community-owned internet system. Now, the reason that we came up with that response was because I had read about Franklin Delano Roosevelt in college when the electric companies back in the 30s and 40s did not want to run electric power lines out to the farmers. FDR basically said, okay, we're going to create a set of community-owned or farmer-owned rural electric cooperatives and use the economic incentives of that community ownership to drive the last mile distribution. And of course, there's a set of ESG outcomes and social benefits that come from that. Based on what you've been hearing from the panelists here, and what have we learned about how we can respond to Carla's comment about folks driving around and seeing infrastructure happen to them, but not being in the driver's seat with it? And how do we start to use what we're learning about capital markets and the federal government's perspective? How do we think about this?
Yeah, I think we just have to be a little more wise and our eyes have to be open. I'll tell a story, Donnell, about being in Denver and watching Denver become designated by many periodicals, you know, #1 city to live in, #1 city to invest in, #1 city to raise your children, #1 city to start your business. We were proud of that. And as mayor, my chest is out. We're top city in the country. And I'm walking down our pedestrian mall one day and this African-American brother stops me. He says, you're proud of your city. I said, I'm very proud of how we're doing, man. It's going well. He goes, but what about us? And it stopped me in my track. And I said, what do you mean, what about us? He said, what about us? Those of us who are not enjoying this ride as well, who've been left behind. And it was eye-opening for me. And this is where the true understanding and definition of what equity really means. Not everyone starts from the same place. Denver took off economically. Not everybody was ready. It was almost like the plane was taking off and folks were just walking up the runway or the stairs, and they took off, and it's like, whoa, you left us. And we as policymakers have to be mindful of that when we do, through our best intentions, go in to improve a neighborhood, to invest in a neighborhood. And we got to recognize that if we look through an equity lens, we got to be more cognizant of that. Not everybody is ready for everything, and not everyone is going to be able to receive it the way we expect them to. And with regards to our capital system, we must understand that there's some things that should never be compromised. America should have been embarrassed that there were households, whole neighborhoods, and not just in urban, in rural communities. One of the most painful news stories I saw was a kid driving 30 miles from his home just to sit on top of the roof of his truck to be able to do his homework. we're the richest country in the world, and to have that sort of deficit in telecommunications, it makes no sense. And I think that's what President Biden was talking about. We have been derelict to invest in our infrastructure that brings equity to our country. And let me just finish with this. If we really want to eradicate poverty, build mobile systems, electrify our system, as Carla, get ready for electrification, as Carla talked about, and make sure that cars are affordable, electric vehicles are affordable to people who are working class every day, near affordable housing. Because most low-income people pay 30% or higher for their homes. And then when you add transportation costs, now you're 45, 50%. That eliminates a lot of opportunity for people. It minimizes their opportunity. So we got a chance during this time that I'm talking about is to think through more of an equity lens and say, we can make some true impact: housing, transit, water, climate, jobs, economic opportunity by investing in our disadvantaged businesses, incentivizing them, stabilizing them, and growing them during this opportunity.
Mr. Deputy Assistant Secretary, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We know that we need distributed green infrastructure. We know that we need smart infrastructure, and we know that we need broadband, and we need to close the digital divide. Very basic. We know that when President Biden outlined the way the White House was thinking about distributing broadband connectivity across America, this idea of community ownership of broadband assets was a part of the plan then and still is now. There are opportunities for low-income families to literally own stock in broadband assets that will be developed across America as part of the infrastructure bill. Just like the rural farmers own their electric companies, as was done by FDR. What are the ways that we can think about this kind of project with some of the programs that you're helping to manage in the cities that you're partnering with?
So first off, I just want to pick up that, we've been talking a lot about the infrastructure plan that's passed, and it's historic and tremendous. And I still want to take the opportunity to highlight that housing is infrastructure. And that's a huge component of the Build Back Better plan that's still withstanding. And to get to the comments you all were just having about making sure that the investments actually, don't just provide someone a roof over their head, but also a job in building the house in the first place. One of the interesting things about HUD is, if Build Back Better passes, we would have a tremendous amount of investment in many different types of housing, increases in home, housing trust fund, public housing, and they all have this requirement attached to them called Section 3, which is basically an effort to employ the individuals that you're serving through the programs. So if you're going and investing a tremendous amount of money in repairing public housing, making it greener, electrifying it, putting renewables on the roof, you should make an effort to employ the folks that actually live in public housing in those projects. That's the good jobs at the end of it. We've launched recently something called the Building Futures Pilot, which is focused specifically on investments in public housing, in green, renewable public housing, and making sure that the residents of those investments are being trained up and participating in the greening and the renewabling, if that's a word, of public housing. Other programs in my space are very flexible. So I have the Community Development Block Grant, the Home Investment Partnerships Program. These give an awful lot of discretion to mayors to figure out what makes sense in their communities to sorry about the mic wobble. There's a little chat in the Zoom that's coming to me. Trying. There we go. And one of the resources that we've been putting out since January is a set of tools and resources and technical assistance that can help communities connect their policy goals with our grant programs. And many of the programs that I administer have been around since the 70s. They often get used the same thing over and over again. There's a great deal of flexibility baked into the programs. If you wanted to say, do climate action, do low-income retrofits of low-income homeowner housing to make them greener and as a result more affordable, because it's not just your mortgage payment at the end of the day, you could use the Community Development Block Grant to do that. and you could do it in a way that employed your residents as well. So we're starting to put out more resources that show how, as we increase these flexible block grant programs, how you can use them to address the climate crisis, to deepen recovery from COVID, which, you know, I think that's going to be the long tail of COVID recovery.
Yeah.
Those small businesses. The best man in my wedding used to own a bagel store right over there in Corktown. I said used to because it didn't make it through the pandemic. And those folks still need our help, and they need to be able to make sure that when we're all done recovering from COVID, we didn't just replace our small businesses with large corporate chains in our communities, but we've actually had an opportunity to support those small businesses.
Yeah. Yeah. Small businesses certainly are going to be the long tail of this. And we need to make sure that more and more of those small businesses are owned by local people from diverse backgrounds. So we are at time. I think this panel hopefully has laid out an informative alternative vision of how we can start to think about infrastructure projects and distributed infrastructure projects in a context that's difficult for our country right now, but that we have inspirational leaders, we have the right policies and budget at the federal government. We have energetic, visionary mayors. We have capital markets that are interested in environmental, social governance investments. Veronica claims that they're really looking for projects aggressively that meet the kinds of criteria that Mark outlines. Melissa has given us a specific set of criteria of the ways that we can think alternatively about the kinds of transformational impact we can have with some of these projects. So encourage all of us to continue the conversation offline, to connect with one another, to identify case studies and really interesting projects on the ground that we can all collaborate on together and really start to demonstrate to the country the kinds of transformational projects, social, climate, health, broadband, closing the digital divide, all the stuff is possible. We can do it together. So thanks for joining us.